What would you do if protecting the person you love meant destroying everything you've worked for? Ethan Kross wasn't just another CEO. He was the youngest tech billionaire in Los Angeles, a man who lived by rules, calculated every move, and trusted no one. But all it took was one moment, one threat whispered to Claire Bennett to shatter the order he'd spent years building. The world was watching. The deal of a lifetime waited on the table. And yet, Ethan knew some things aren't worth the cost, no matter how many zeros are on the check. If you were standing in that room with the cameras flashing and your future on the line, would you walk away if you find this story touching? Comment 1. If you think this video needs improvement, comment 2. Now, let's begin at the very start, when a single job interview set everything in motion. The city of Los Angeles shimmered below like a galaxy spilled across the earth, each point of light a reminder of the millions of lives moving beneath the night sky. Ethan Kross stood alone in his office on the top floor of the sleek glass tower that bore his company's name. His reflection stared back at him from the floor-to-ceiling window, perfectly pressed suit, sharp features, the kind of image that belonged on the cover of Forbes. He had everything money could buy, but nothing money couldn't. In 30 short years, Ethan had built an empire in tech, conquering markets most men twice his age couldn't even enter. He had the kind of power people whispered about at dinner parties and envied in boardrooms. But success, he'd learned, came with a heavy price. Trust was a currency rarer than gold. After a series of betrayals by a co-founder, by someone he'd once called a friend, Ethan no longer let anyone close enough to hurt him. His life was ordered, airtight, and every relationship he allowed into it served a purpose. Until this morning, when his personal assistant, his gatekeeper to the chaos, had quit without warning. Now, the meticulously crafted machine of his life was stalling. Meetings were stacking up. Calls went unanswered. Contracts sat unsigned. Even Ethan's famously steady calendar, a work of logistical art, was unraveling. He hated the feeling. Control was his oxygen, and it was slipping through his fingers. Get me interviews. He'd told Martha Lewis, his longtime executive coordinator, who had been with him since the early days. Today. That's how he ended up here, standing over a stack of resumes in the soft glow of his desk lamp, each one blending into the next. Impressive credentials, polished references, perfectly rehearsed bullet points. And yet, none of them felt right. Too corporate, too safe, too predictable. Ethan didn't have time for predictable. He needed someone who could anticipate problems before they exploded, someone who wouldn't crumble under pressure. A knock sounded on the glass door. Martha stepped in, her silver hair pulled back in its usual neat bun. "Last candidate," she said, "Claire Bennett." Before Ethan could respond, the door opened again, and there she was. Claire was nothing like the others who had paraded through his office today. No stiff black pantsuit or high-gloss heels. She wore dark jeans, a crisp white blouse rolled to the elbows, and scuffed brown ankle boots. Her hair, the color of chestnut, was pulled into a low ponytail, a few loose strands framing her face. She carried no leather folio, no flashy bag, just a slim notebook tucked under her arm. Her hazel eyes locked on his, steady and unflinching, as if she had already measured him and found him worth the effort. "Mr. Kross," she said, her voice clear. "Thank you for seeing me." He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk, curious despite himself. "You don't have much corporate experience," he noted, glancing at her resume. "I learn fast," she replied without hesitation. "I've worked in high-pressure environments. I know how to organize chaos, solve problems, and keep my composure when everything is falling apart." Something in her tone made him look up. She wasn't selling herself. She was stating facts, and she didn't blink under his scrutiny. Why this job, he asked. "I'm good at making people's lives easier," she said simply. "And from what I've heard, yours could use a little less fire to put out." The corner of his mouth almost lifted. Bold, direct. Most people in her position would have tripped over themselves to impress him. Claire seemed more interested in telling the truth. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. The others today had blended into a blur, but she stood out in sharp focus. There was a quiet confidence about her, like she knew exactly who she was and didn't need anyone's approval. It was dangerous, he thought, to be intrigued by a job candidate. Dangerous to let that flicker of curiosity turn into something else. And yet, for reasons he couldn't quite name, he found himself not wanting her to walk out of his office. "You're hired," he said. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, but it vanished just as quickly. "When do I start now?" Ethan replied. He rose, signaling that the meeting was over. "Martha will get you set up." Claire nodded, turned to leave, and for the briefest second glanced back at him over her shoulder. It was nothing more than a look yet. It left Ethan with an unfamiliar thought. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something he hadn't planned for. As the door closed behind her, Ethan returned to his desk, but the neat stack of resumes suddenly seemed irrelevant. For the first time in a long while, his focus wasn't on the next deal or the next meeting. It was on a pair of hazel eyes and the question he didn't yet know how to answer. Ethan didn't usually bother with interviews. Normally, Martha filtered candidates so well that by the time someone sat in front of him, it was a formality. But this time was different. His last assistant's sudden departure had left too many fires to put out, and he couldn't afford another misstep. Claire Bennett sat across from him in the high-backed leather chair. Her posture relaxed, but not careless. Up close, Ethan noticed details he hadn't caught at first glance. Her blouse was crisp but inexpensive, the kind that held its shape without screaming for attention. The jeans were dark and clean, and her boots, while scuffed, looked comfortable enough to move quickly in. Practical choices. Most telling, though, were her eyes. Hazel, sharp, and steady. They didn't dart around the room like most people's did under his scrutiny. They stayed on him, as if she had nothing to hide. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "You know this job isn't typical." "I gathered," she replied. Tone even. "Your assistant runs interference, solves problems before they land on your desk, and makes sure the right people get through to you while the wrong ones don't. That's the short version, right?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That's the polite version. The reality is, it's chaos. My schedule changes by the hour. My phone doesn't stop. People will try to get to me through you by charm, by pressure, sometimes by threats. You'll work late, you'll work early, and you'll be expected to handle it without mistakes." Claire didn't flinch. "I've handled worse." Something in her voice made him pause. It wasn't bravado, it was conviction. "Worse?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly, as if weighing how much to say. "Let's just say, I've been in situations where getting it wrong wasn't an option." The answer was vague, but it carried weight. It made him wonder where she'd been, what she'd done, and why a woman with that kind of steel was sitting in his office for a job most people saw as glorified scheduling. "What do you get out of this?" he asked. "It's long hours and high stress. The money's good, but that's not usually enough." "I like putting things in order," Claire said simply. "And I like working for people who value that." He studied her, trying to decide if that was the whole truth. Something about her made him think there was more an undercurrent he couldn't quite read. "Let's talk terms," Ethan said finally. He opened a drawer and pulled out a single-page agreement. 90 days. That's the probation period. You work directly with me and report only to me. If it works out, we extend. If not. He let the sentence hang. Claire glanced over the page, scanning quickly. You want me to sign this now? Yes, he said, unless you need time to think about it. She looked up at him again, a faint smile playing on her lips. I don't need time. She signed in one smooth motion and slid the paper back across the desk. It was too easy. And that unsettled him. Ethan Cross didn't trust easily. He certainly didn't hand over access to his schedule, contacts, and daily life to someone he'd known for less than an hour. But here he was, watching her name appear in neat, deliberate handwriting at the bottom of the page, and feeling oddly certain. He stood, extending his hand. Welcome to Cross Technologies, Ms. Bennett. She shook it firmly. You won't regret it. As Martha returned to escort Claire to her new workspace, Ethan lingered at the desk. His logical mind told him he should have vetted her more thoroughly, should have asked harder questions about her background, should have double-checked every detail. Yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, he believed her. Still, her earlier words echoed in his mind. I've handled worse. Worse than what? And why did it sound like more than just work experience? He didn't have answers yet, but something told him he would. Through the glass wall of his office, Ethan watched Claire walk away beside Martha, her stride steady and unhurried. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment the gears of his carefully ordered life began to shift, one deliberate step at a time. Claire didn't waste time making an impression. By the end of her first week, Ethan's chaotic calendar, once a battlefield of overlapping meetings, last-minute calls, and forgotten deadlines, ran with the precision of a well-oiled machine. He noticed the change one Monday morning when he walked into his office and found his schedule neatly printed and waiting on his desk, color-coded by priority. Meetings that usually dragged on had been trimmed to their essentials. Calls that didn't need his attention had been redirected. The usual bottlenecks in his day had somehow vanished. When a minor PR crisis flared a negative article about a product glitch, Claire handled it before it reached his desk. She'd contacted the communications team, arranged for a statement, and scheduled an interview with a tech blog to set the record straight. By the time Ethan found out about it, the issue was already cooling off online. How did you know to do that? He asked over lunch in the conference room. Claire shrugged, sipping her iced tea. I read the room. And the comments. It was a simple answer, but it carried that same quiet confidence she'd shown in the interview. Late one night, Ethan was still in his office long after the building had gone quiet. The city lights stretched out below him, a blur through the glass. His desk was littered with documents, his laptop open to a spreadsheet he'd been reviewing for hours. The click of the door startled him. Claire stepped in, holding a tall paper cup. You've been here since before sunrise. Figured you could use this. He raised an eyebrow. I didn't ask for coffee. You didn't have to, she said, setting it down within reach. You've been rubbing your temples for the last 20 minutes. Caffeine helps. Ethan picked up the cup, curious. One sip, and he froze. This is exactly how I take it. She smiled faintly. Martha told me you're picky about your coffee, and that you use 2 teaspoons of sugar, not 3. He tried not to let the warmth in his chest show. Efficient and observant, he murmured. Another small change came when Claire adjusted his meal plan. She'd noticed he often skipped lunch or settled for whatever was quickest, so she started placing orders for balanced meals. Everything was portioned in ounces and cups, not grams or milliliters. American measurements he didn't have to think about. One afternoon, he opened the neatly packed container she'd left on his desk. Grilled chicken, 8 ounces. Brown rice, 1 cup. Steamed broccoli, half a cup. You've been talking to my nutritionist. I've been talking to you, she corrected. You said you were feeling low energy around 3 o'clock. Thought I'd fix that. The most unexpected moment came on a cool Friday morning in late October. Los Angeles rarely dipped below 60 degrees, but the ocean breeze had turned sharp overnight. Ethan arrived at the office without a jacket. As he passed Claire's desk, she looked up from her computer. You might want to grab something warmer if you're going out later, she said casually. It's going to drop into the 50s tonight. He paused, surprised. You checking the weather for me now? Someone should, she replied with a small grin. You forget your own appointments, let alone the forecast. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way she said them. Not as an employee speaking to a boss, but as someone who noticed, who cared enough to mention it. Ethan found himself paying more attention to her than he meant to. The way she focused when typing, brow furrowed in concentration. The way she greeted people by name, even those others overlooked. The way she seemed to glide through the day without letting anything stick to her, no matter how chaotic it became. Still, he kept his distance. At least, he tried. One evening, as he left his office, he passed Claire still at her desk. The floor was nearly empty, the hum of the building's HVAC the only sound. She didn't notice him at first, her head bent over a list she was organizing. You should go home, he said. She glanced up, unfazed. Not until I finish this. You've got a full week ahead, and I'd rather not have you walk into Monday unprepared. Ethan lingered in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, then nodded. Don't stay too late. I won't, she promised, though he suspected she would anyway. As he rode down in the elevator, he caught his reflection in the mirrored wall. Something was shifting, subtle but undeniable. Claire Bennett had been here less than 2 weeks, and already the edges of his carefully built walls were softening. Outside, the night air carried the faint salt of the Pacific. Ethan walked toward his car, wondering not for the first time why he'd hired her so quickly. And why, even now, he couldn't imagine the office without her. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and strong coffee, the kind that sat too long on a hot plate. Ethan sat at the head of the table, fingers steepled, while the representatives from Hamilton Supply reviewed their latest contract proposal. The deal was important, a multi-million-dollar partnership that would secure inventory for the next 2 years. Claire sat 2 seats to his right, her laptop open, fingers moving quickly as she took notes. She'd spent the last week preparing for this meeting, combing through the terms, highlighting areas that could be improved. Halfway through the presentation, Roger Hamilton himself leaned forward, his tie loosened, his tone casual, too casual. You're quite the note-taker, Ms. Bennett, he said with a smirk. I guess that's why Mr. Cross keeps you around. Ethan's gaze sharpened, but Claire kept her expression neutral. I document so Mr. Cross can review later, she said evenly. Roger chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Sure. Pretty face, fast typing every CEO's dream. Right. The room went still. Claire's fingers froze over the keyboard. A flicker of something anger, embarrassment crossed her face before she masked it. Ethan's jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice was calm. Mr. Hamilton, Ethan said, his tone measured. Claire isn't here because she's good at typing. She's here because she's the most capable person I've met in years. She's the reason this meeting is happening at all. If that's unclear, then perhaps we need to reevaluate whether Hamilton Supply is the kind of partner we want. Roger blinked, caught off guard. I didn't mean I'm sure you didn't. Ethan cut in, his voice still cool but edged with finality. But this company values professionalism. Let's keep the discussion where it belongs, on the work. A beat of silence passed before Roger cleared his throat and returned to the numbers on the page. But the energy in the room had shifted. Claire kept typing, but her thoughts weren't on the contract anymore. She'd handled worse comments before. She knew how to deflect, how to keep moving without showing a crack. But the way Ethan had stepped in, not with anger, but with calm certainty, caught her off guard. Most executives ignored moments like that, pretended they hadn't heard. Ethan had made it clear that wasn't how he operated. The rest of the meeting moved briskly. Terms were discussed, agreements noted, and eventually everyone shook hands, though Roger's grip with Ethan was notably cooler. As they left the building, the autumn sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Ethan held the door for her without a word. They walked side by side toward the car, the sound of traffic filling the silence. Claire glanced at him, the question forming before she could stop it. "You didn't have to say anything in there." "Yes," he said simply, not looking at her. "I did." She studied his profile, the set of his jaw, the faint crease between his brows. He wasn't the type to say things he didn't mean. That made it harder to brush off the sudden warmth in her chest. "I appreciate it," she said quietly. He gave a small nod, but his gaze stayed fixed ahead. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt different, charged, somehow, as if something unspoken had shifted in those few minutes in the conference room. When they reached the car, Ethan opened the passenger door for her. Claire hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment press in. She knew the lines in this kind of work, what could and couldn't be allowed, the boundaries that kept things from getting complicated. And yet, part of her wondered if this was the first crack in the wall they'd both been holding up. She slid into the seat, forcing herself to focus on the next task, the next meeting. But as Ethan rounded the hood and got in beside her, she caught his reflection in the side window. He wasn't looking at her, but his jaw had relaxed, and there was a softness there she hadn't seen before. The engine started, and they merged into the slow stream of evening traffic. Claire kept her gaze on the skyline ahead, but inside, she was turning over the same thought again and again. Something was changing, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. As the city lights began to blink on, one by one, Claire realized she hadn't typed a single word in the last 10 minutes, not in her notes, not in her mind. All she could think about was the way Ethan's voice had sounded when he'd said, "Yes, I did." The drive back from the supplier's dinner was quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't awkward but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Claire sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed on the blur of streetlights passing by. The evening had gone smoothly enough, no sharp words, no tension like earlier in the week, but she could feel Ethan's mind working beside her, his attention split between the road and something else entirely. They were 3 blocks from the parking garage when the first drop hit the windshield, then another. Within seconds, the sky opened, releasing a downpour so sudden and fierce it blurred the world into streaks of silver. The wipers swiped furiously, but visibility was nearly gone. Ethan spotted a small corner store ahead, its faded awning flapping in the wind. Without thinking, he pulled over, killed the engine, and was out of the car in one motion. "Come on," he said, opening her door before she could react. Claire grabbed her bag and followed him into the rain, her boots splashing through shallow puddles. The cold hit instantly, soaking through the thin fabric of her blouse. Ethan's hand found her elbow, steadying her as they reached the narrow strip of shelter. Under the awning, the rain was a relentless curtain just inches away. The noise was deafening, water slapping pavement, gurgling through overworked drains, pelting the metal roof above them. The air was sharp with the scent of wet asphalt and something faintly sweet from the store behind them. Neither of them spoke. Ethan's breath came in slow, measured pulls, his shoulders rising and falling beside her. His hair, usually immaculate, was damp at the edges, a single drop clinging to his jaw before sliding down. He shoved his hands into his pockets, not trusting them to stay at his sides. He told himself he was only making sure she stayed dry. That the reason he'd pulled her under the awning so quickly was efficiency, not instinct. But the truth pressed harder than the rain he'd been watching her all night. Watching the way she carried herself through the crowded room, the way she navigated conversation with grace, even when people underestimated her. And when the storm had started, the thought of her walking through it alone had been unthinkable. Claire kept her eyes on the rain, though she could feel his gaze flicker toward her now and then. Her hair clung to her neck, a few strands curling at her temples. She crossed her arms, partly for warmth, partly to keep from fidgeting. It had been a long time since she'd stood this close to someone who made her feel unsettled. Not in a bad way, but in the dangerous way that made old memories stir. She'd promised herself never to blur lines again, not after the last time ended in a mess she'd had to clean up alone. But here he was, Ethan Cross, her boss standing inches away in the dim yellow glow of the store's sign, and the sound of rain seemed to fill the space between them with something neither of them dared name. A car roared past, sending a spray of water up over the curb. Claire instinctively stepped closer to avoid the splash, her shoulder brushing his arm. The contact was brief, but Ethan felt it like a spark. He glanced at her then, really looked at her. There was no makeup left to hide behind, no carefully curated appearance, just Claire, damp and flushed from the cold, her eyes darker in the shadows. She met his gaze for a fraction of a second before looking away, and he knew she'd felt it too. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught. What could he say that wouldn't cross the line they'd both been pretending wasn't there instead? He let the silence hold. Minutes passed, the storm showing no sign of easing. The awning dripped steadily at the edges, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. Claire shifted her weight, her arms still crossed, and exhaled softly. She told herself the chill was why her heart was beating faster. When the headlights of their driver's car finally appeared through the rain, Ethan stepped forward, giving her space to pass first. She moved without hesitation, the moment breaking as quickly as it had formed. Back in the warmth of the car, she busied herself with adjusting her seatbelt, while he focused on the road ahead. But neither of them mentioned the awning, or the silence, or the way the air had felt thick enough to touch. By the time they reached her building, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Claire thanked him quietly before heading inside, and Ethan waited until the door closed behind her before pulling away. But as he drove, the image stayed her beside him in the half-light, the rain falling all around, and the gnawing certainty that this was no longer just about work. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco glittered under chandeliers the size of small cars. Reporters lined the back wall, their lenses trained on the long table set up on the stage, where the signing ceremony for a billion-dollar partnership was minutes away. Ethan stood near the center, surrounded by executives and attorneys. His suit was impeccable, his expression composed, but inside, he was calculating every angle of the deal. This agreement would secure distribution in Asia for Cross Technology's newest software, a game-changer in both reach and revenue. Claire was off to the side, headset in place, managing the last-minute logistics. She'd coordinated the travel, the press invitations, even the seating chart. Everything was running on time, which in events like this was rare enough to be a miracle. That was when Richard Hale appeared, a venture capitalist with a smile that never reached his eyes. Hale was as notorious for his business acumen as for the way he treated people, especially women. Claire had avoided him all morning, but now he stepped directly into her path backstage, blocking the narrow corridor. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his voice low. "You've done a fine job putting this together." She nodded politely. "Thank you. Mr. Hale, if you'll excuse me." He shifted, making it clear she wasn't going anywhere just yet. "I know who you are. Before this gig, you were a journalist, weren't you? The one who stirred up trouble for half the state government." Her jaw tightened. "I reported facts." "Sure," Hale said with a smirk. "And when those facts embarrassed the wrong people, you got burned, lost your job, blacklisted. Shame, really. But here's the thing, you're in my world now. And in my world, favors matter. So, if you want to keep that nice desk outside Cross's office, you might think twice before meddling in affairs you don't understand." The words hit like cold steel. Memories flashed, shouting in a newsroom, her byline being pulled, the long walk out of the building with a box in her arms. She'd buried all that under layers of composure, but in an instant, it was there again. She opened her mouth to respond, but a voice cut in. "Is there a problem here?" Ethan's tone was quiet, but there was nothing casual about it. He was standing a few feet away, his eyes locked on Hale. "Not at all," Hale said. "All false charm. Just reminding Ms. Bennett how high the stakes are in a deal like this." Ethan stepped closer, his height casting a shadow between them. "If intimidation is part of your negotiation tactics, you can forget about this deal." Hale's smile faltered. "Come on, Ethan. Don't be dramatic." Ethan turned toward the stage, where cameras were already flashing, journalists waiting. Then he looked back at Hale, his voice carrying enough to be overheard by nearby staff. "No deal," he said flatly. "I don't work with men who think intimidation is a negotiation tactic." The room shifted in an instant. Heads turned. A murmur rose, and before anyone could recover, the photographers started snapping Ethan walking away from a deal worth more than most companies dreamed of, all because of a conversation they hadn't quite heard. Hale swore under his breath, but Ethan didn't stop. Claire followed him, her pulse racing, weaving past the startled faces of investors and press alike. By the time they reached the side hallway, the noise of the ballroom was muffled behind them. "Ethan," she began, but he turned, and the look in his eyes made the rest of the sentence dissolve. There was no anger there, only an intensity that seemed to pin her in place. "You don't let anyone talk to you like that," he said, his voice low. "Not while I'm in the room. Not ever." "I could have handled it," she replied, though her voice was softer than she intended. "I know you could," he said, stepping closer, "but you shouldn't have to." For a moment, neither of them moved. The muffled hum of the conference seeped through the walls, but here, in the narrow hallway, it was just them two people standing on the edge of a line they'd both been avoiding. And then he closed the distance. The first touch was almost cautious, his hand lifting to her cheek as if giving her a chance to pull away. When she didn't, the rest happened fast, his mouth on hers, fierce and certain, the kind of kiss that didn't ask for permission because it already knew the answer. Claire's hands were on his chest before she realized she'd moved, gripping the fabric of his suit as if to anchor herself. Every thought about boundaries, about rules, about how this could complicate everything, blurred into the background. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. He kept his forehead against hers, his voice rough. "I'm not sorry." Her pulse was still racing. "You should be." "Not a chance," he said, and there was something in his tone that made her wonder if she should be more afraid of how much she believed him. Somewhere down the hall, a voice called Ethan's name. Urgent. The conference wasn't over, and neither were the consequences of what had just happened. But as they walked back toward the noise and the cameras, Claire knew one thing for certain: nothing between them would be the same again. By the time Ethan's plane touched down in Los Angeles that night, the story was already everywhere. Cross walks away from billion-dollar deal-over assistant. Who is Claire Bennett, the woman behind the drama? The headlines multiplied by the hour, each one more intrusive than the last. Reporters dug up photos from Claire's past, unearthed old articles with her byline, and, inevitably, the scandal that had ended her journalism career. The accusations were skewed, twisted into clickbait. They painted her as reckless, opportunistic, a liability to any company she touched. By morning, the gossip channels had pieced together an unflattering narrative. She was too close to her boss and too dangerous to be kept on his payroll. At 8 a.m., Ethan's assistant Martha met him outside the boardroom, her face tight. "They're waiting for you," she said quietly. "And Ethan, they're not happy." Inside, the atmosphere was thick. The long table was filled with the company's board members, most of them older men in tailored suits. The CEO chair at the head of the table sat empty, waiting for him. The chairman, Paul Mercer, spoke first. "Ethan, we've reviewed the fallout from yesterday. The press coverage is a mess. Investors are nervous. We need to contain this." Ethan took his seat, meeting each gaze in turn. Meaning, Mercer said. "You need to distance yourself from Ms. Bennett immediately. She's to be reassigned or let go. This company can't afford to be tied to her name right now." A murmur of agreement rippled around the table. Ethan leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You think removing her fixes the problem? It stops the bleeding," Mercer replied. "And frankly, Ethan, it sends a message that you put the company first." He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Across the city, Claire sat at her desk, aware of every glance in her direction. The whispers were quieter today, but they were there, curling through the hallways. She'd read the articles, seen the comments. At noon, she sent a simple message to Martha. "Please tell Mr. Cross I won't be in tomorrow." Then she gathered her things. She didn't say goodbye to anyone, just walked out of the glass tower and into the cool gray drizzle outside. Ethan didn't find out until late that evening. He came out of a conference call to find her desk empty. The personal touches gone a small plant, a framed photo of her niece, the mug she always used. Martha stood nearby, uneasy. She said she didn't want to cause trouble, thought it was better for everyone if she left. Ethan stared at the vacant desk for a long moment, then turned on his heel and headed for the elevator. The next morning, the boardroom was full again. Ethan walked in without notes, without a laptop. Mercer started in immediately. "We trust you've had time to reconsider." Ethan raised a hand. "No need. I've made my decision." The room stilled. "If you think I can't lead this company because I'm in love with someone, then I'll save you the trouble. I resign." Shock rippled through the board. "Ethan, be reasonable. I am," he said, his voice calm but final. "Claire Bennett is the reason I still believe in people. If that's a problem for you, then this isn't a company I want to run." For a moment, no one spoke. Mercer's face was pale. "You'd walk away from everything you built," Ethan stood. "I'd rather lose everything than lose her." He didn't wait for a reply. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, soaking his suit as soon as he stepped into the street. He didn't care. He got into his car and drove, the wipers struggling against the sheets of water. When he reached Claire's apartment building in Westwood, the street was slick with puddles. He climbed out and crossed to her door, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. It took her a long moment to answer. When she did, Her expression shifted from surprise to something softer, more uncertain. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" He stood in her doorway, water dripping from his shoulders. "You left without telling me. I didn't want to make things worse for you." His eyes held hers. "I'd rather lose everything than lose you." The words hung between them, heavy and certain. Her breath caught, and for the first time in days, she let herself step forward. She closed the distance and wrapped her arms around him, her cheek pressed against the damp fabric of his suit. He held her tightly, as if anchoring them both against the storm outside. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. As the rain drummed against the windows, Ethan knew the decision was irreversible. He'd chosen her, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The weeks that followed were quieter, though not without challenge. Ethan's departure from Cross Technologies had sent ripples through the business world. Some investors called him reckless. Others called him principled. Ethan didn't care about either label. What mattered was the woman sitting across from him now at a small cafe in Santa Monica, sketching ideas on a napkin. They were building something new? Not an empire this time, just a company that could breathe. No board members to appease. No pressure to double profits every quarter. They wanted to focus on meaningful projects, the kind that solved problems without selling out values. Claire tapped her pen against the napkin. "If we start with 3 clients, we can keep the team lean. More control. Less noise." Ethan smiled faintly. "You're already better at this than half the executives I've met." "That's not a high bar," she teased, and for the first time in days, her laugh was light and unguarded. Their days fell into a rhythm that felt human. Mornings often began at the local farmer's market. They'd wander between stalls, picking out bunches of fresh basil, cartons of strawberries, loaves of bread still warm from the oven. Ethan, who used to rush through every errand, found himself slowing down. He'd carry the bags while Claire debated the merits of heirloom tomatoes versus vine-ripened. Sometimes they'd stop for coffee at a sidewalk stand, sipping from paper cups while the ocean breeze tangled her hair. Afternoons were for work emails, calls, planning sessions at the kitchen table of Ethan's condo, which had slowly begun to look less like a showpiece and more like a home. In the evenings, they cooked together. Claire would chop vegetables while Ethan manned the stove, learning how not to over-saute garlic. They moved around each other easily, passing knives and spices without speaking, as if they'd been doing it for years. One night, as they sat down to dinner, a simple roast chicken with rosemary potatoes, Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You know, I've closed deals worth more than some countries' GDP, but this," he gestured between them, the meal, the candle flickering on the table. "This feels like winning." Claire smiled, a little shy. "That's because there's no one keeping score." Sundays became their time for the ocean. They'd drive down to Santa Monica, kick off their shoes, and walk barefoot along the shore. The Pacific stretched endlessly, waves rolling in with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. One afternoon, as they stood watching the sun sink toward the horizon, Ethan said quietly, "I used to think trust was something you earned once and then kept forever. But it's not. It's something you choose over and over." Claire looked at him, her expression soft. "And sometimes you have to unlearn the reasons you stopped choosing it." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. The warmth of her palm against his felt like an anchor, a reminder that the storms they'd weathered had not broken them. They still had disagreements about clients, about deadlines, about whether to take on a project that might stretch them too thin. But now, instead of shutting down or retreating into silence, they talked, really talked. One evening, after a particularly tense debate over a potential contract, Claire poured them each a glass of wine and said, "I'm not going to run at the first sign of trouble, Ethan, but I need you to tell me when you're afraid, not just when you're angry." He met her gaze. "And I need you to believe that you're not a liability to me. Claire, you're the reason I'm doing this differently." The air between them eased. They clinked glasses, not as a truce, but as an agreement to keep showing up for each other. By the end of that first month, the new company had its first signed contract. It wasn't glamorous, a local startup needing a marketing overhaul, but it was theirs. That night, they celebrated on the balcony with takeout pizza, the city lights stretching out below. Claire leaned against him, the scent of basil and sea salt still clinging to her from the day. Ethan rested his chin on her hair. "We're going to be okay," he said. Claire tilted her head to look at him. "We already are." As the night air wrapped around them, Ethan thought of all the choices that had led here, the risks, the losses, the moments in the rain, and for the first time, he wasn't thinking about the next deal or the next battle. He was thinking about forever. The late afternoon sun cast Malibu's coastline in shades of gold and rose, the waves catching the light as they curled toward shore. Ethan drove with the windows down, letting the ocean air roll in, warm and salty. Claire sat beside him, hair loose, her eyes curious, as she watched the winding road. "Are you going to tell me where we're going?" she asked, a smile tugging at her lips. "Not yet," he said, glancing at her with that half-smile that always made her wonder what he was planning. They pulled into a narrow turnout overlooking the Pacific, a spot so secluded it could have been missed entirely. Ethan parked and stepped out, coming around to open her door. She followed him to the edge of the bluff, where the view stretched for miles in every direction, endless blue water, the horizon blurring into the sky. Claire took a deep breath. "It's beautiful." "This is where it happened," Ethan said quietly. She looked at him, puzzled. "Where what happened?" "Where I knew," he replied, eyes still on the horizon. "It was months ago, after that meeting in Santa Monica. We drove up the coast to clear our heads. You were standing right here, wind in your hair, talking about how the sea always reminded you of home. I looked at you, and I thought, I can't imagine my life without her." Claire's lips parted, but no words came. The sound of the waves seemed to grow softer, as if the ocean itself was listening. She felt the sting of tears before she realized they'd formed, slipping warm down her cheeks. You never said that," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "I didn't have to. I've been saying it in every way I could since that day." Her shoulders shook with a quiet laugh that was half a sob, the kind that comes when the heart can't decide if it's breaking or overflowing. She brushed at her cheeks, but the tears kept coming, carried by a tide she couldn't stop and didn't want to. Ethan stepped closer, his hand finding hers, and in one smooth motion, he slipped a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. "Claire, I've spent most of my life thinking I could control everything, that if I kept my guard up, nothing could hurt me. But then, you walked into my office, and everything I thought I knew stopped making sense. You've been my partner in chaos, my anchor in the storms, and the reason I believe in trust again." He dropped to one knee, the sand crunching softly beneath him. Opening the box, he revealed a simple, elegant ring, a single diamond set in a band of gold worn smooth by years. "This was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me before she passed, told me to give it to the woman I couldn't live without. That's you, Claire. Will you marry me for a heartbeat? The world seemed to still. The waves hushed, the wind softened, and all she could hear was the rush of her own pulse. Yes, she whispered, her voice catching. Yes. Ethan. He slid the ring onto her finger, his hands warm against hers despite the ocean breeze. She pulled him up, and they fell into each other's arms, holding tight as if they could lock the moment in place forever. The sun dipped lower, bathing them in light so rich it seemed almost unreal. Ethan pressed his forehead to hers, smiling in a way she'd never seen unguarded, full of something brighter than triumph. "I love you," he murmured. "I love you too," she said, her fingers curling into the back of his jacket. They stayed like that until the horizon swallowed the last of the sun, the waves below marking the steady passage of time. When they finally stepped back, Ethan took her hand and kissed it, the diamond catching the final streak of daylight. As they walked back to the car, the first stars began to appear above the darkening ocean. Claire glanced at the ring, then at the man beside her, and thought not for the first time that some risks were worth everything. The next step was only days away. The late afternoon sun dipped low over Malibu, painting the waves in molten gold. The beach was quiet except for the rhythmic crash of the tide and the soft murmur of guests gathered in a semicircle on the sand. White chairs lined a simple aisle strewn with pale rose petals. At the far end stood an arch draped in white linen and wildflowers swaying gently in the ocean breeze. Ethan stood beneath it, his gray suit crisp but softened by the open collar of his shirt. His gaze swept the small group family, a few close friends, and the people who had walked with them through every battle of the last year. Martha Lewis sat in the front row, smiling in a way Ethan had rarely seen during their years together. Beside her, David Cross, Ethan's older brother, gave him a quiet nod of approval. Even Richard Hale wasn't a shadow anymore, gone from their lives, his attempts to stir trouble having fallen flat months ago. The music shifted, and every head turned. Claire appeared at the top of the aisle, her satin gown simple but luminous in the golden light. The skirt caught the wind as she walked barefoot through the sand, each step measured but sure. Her hair was loose, waves tumbling over her shoulders, a small spray of baby's breath woven in. She carried no bouquet, her hands were free, open, ready. When she reached him, Ethan's breath caught, the world narrowing to her and the way the sunlight seemed to settle just for her. The officiant welcomed everyone, but Ethan barely heard the words. His focus was on the woman standing across from him, the one who had turned his ordered, guarded life into something unpredictable and worth every risk. When it was time for vows, Ethan took her hands, his voice steady. "No matter what storms come, I'll always choose you. I chose you the day you walked into my office, and I've chosen you every day since, even when it cost me everything I thought I couldn't lose. You've been my compass when I was lost, my anchor when I was drowning. You're the only deal I'll never walk away from." Claire's eyes shimmered, the sound of the ocean folding around her words as she spoke. "You gave me back my faith in people and in myself. When the world tried to define me by my mistakes, you saw the truth. You've been my safe place, my reminder that trust isn't a weakness, it's the strongest thing we can give each other. And I will spend the rest of my life choosing you, too." The officiant smiled. "You may kiss your bride." Ethan didn't hesitate. He pulled her close, their lips meeting in a kiss that carried every unspoken promise between them. Behind them, the waves roared in approval, and the guests erupted into applause. After the ceremony, they walked hand in hand along the water's edge, the train of Claire's dress trailing through the sand. Martha approached with a hug for each of them, her eyes misty. "You two, you proved everyone wrong." Ethan chuckled. That was never the point. Claire squeezed his hand. "We just wanted to prove it to ourselves." David joined them, clapping Ethan on the back. "Mom would have been proud. You finally learned the one deal worth making." Ethan glanced at Claire, the ring glinting on her finger. "Yeah," he said softly. "I did." As the sun sank, casting the world in deep amber, the reception unfolded under strings of lights strung between driftwood poles. There was no grand ballroom, no towering cake, just long tables set with mismatched china, the scent of grilled fish and rosemary bread in the air. Guests laughed over shared plates. Children darted between tables, chasing the tide. At one point, Ethan caught Claire standing apart, watching the scene with a soft smile. He joined her, sliding an arm around her waist. "Penny for your thoughts," he murmured. She leaned into him. "Just thinking about how far we've come. A year ago, this would have been impossible." And now she turned to him, her smile bright. "Now it feels inevitable." They stayed like that until the first stars blinked awake over the Pacific, the tide pulling in and out as if to keep time with their heartbeats. In a city where trust was the rarest currency, they found it in each other. And this was just the beginning of forever. The waves rolled on, the lights flickered against the night, and somewhere between the tide and the stars, Ethan and Claire began the rest of their lives together, as they had chosen, and as they always would, in a world that often measures worth by titles, bank accounts, and accomplishments. Ethan and Claire's story is a quiet reminder of what truly lasts. Success can open doors, but trust and love are what keep them open. Ethan had built an empire by being careful, by never letting anyone close enough to hurt him. Claire had learned to survive by protecting her heart after betrayal. Yet, both discovered that the walls they built to stay safe were the same walls keeping them from living fully. Sometimes, the bravest choice is not the one that protects what you have, but the one that risks it for what matters most. Trust isn't something you win once it's something you choose, day after day, even when the past has given you reasons to doubt. For anyone who has loved and lost, or who has felt the weight of protecting their heart, remember it's never too late to choose connection over isolation, to let someone in, and to build something that money cannot buy. Because in the end, what we hold on to isn't the things we owned, it's the people we walked beside. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and heal. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep bringing you moments that remind us all of the power of love, trust, and human connection.